Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Trans Authors on Characters, Stories, and Industry. Real quick, I'm just going to let you know who our wonderful panelists are. So first up here, we have Tobi Hill-Meyer. Tobi Hill-Meyer was named number 3 in Velvet Park Media's list of the 25 most significant queer women in 2010, and is one of the few people in the world who can claim being both an award-winning porn creator and a children's book author. She is a multiracial trans woman with well over a decade experience working with feminist and LGBTQ organizations, and currently serves as board chair at Gender Justice League, as well as working as communications coordinator at Gay City, Seattle's LGBTQ center. With her background in activism, she operates her own media production company, Handbasket Productions, creating stories and entertainment that reflect community needs and values, including her erotic documentary series, Doing It Online, as well as her upcoming anthology, Struggling to Be Whole. A what? Nerve Endings. Yeah, it is. It's Nerve Endings, the new trans erotic? Yes. Yeah. Find out more about her. I'm not going to read that, but because it's in here and it's a URL, but you can check that out. Next up, we have Laylah Hunter. Laylah Hunter is a third-gendered butch queer who writes true stories about imaginary people in worlds that never were. Most of their work deals with queer characters, erotic themes, and the search for happy endings in unfavorable circumstances. Hunter's mild-mannered alter ego lives in Seattle at the mercy of the requisite cats, cultivating the requisite caffeine habit, and dreams of a day when telling stories will pay all the bills. Their published fiction includes the novel Gabriel's City and several short stories. These are, oh my God, they're still in order. This is the best book ever. E.E. Ottoman grew up surrounded by the farmlands and forests of upstate New York. They started writing as soon as they learned how and have yet to stop. Ottoman attended Earlham College and graduated with a degree in history before going on to receive a graduate degree in history as well. These days, they divide their time between history, writing, and book preservation. Ottoman is also a disabled queer trans man whose pronouns are they, them, their, or he, him, his. Mostly, though, they are a person who is passionate about history, stories, and the spaces between the two. Their work includes Documenting Light, the Mechanical Universe series, and Saloon Profair. Next up, we have J.K. Pendragon. J.K. Pendragon is a Canadian author with a love of all things romantic and fantastical. As a bisexual, genderqueer person, they are dedicated to writing stories with adventures and happy endings for characters all across the rainbow spectrum. Jay currently resides in British Columbia with their boyfriend and cat, where they enjoy the traditional writerly pursuits of drinking tea in bed and avoiding contact with other humans. Finally, we have Alex Powell. Alex Powell is an avid writer and reader of sci-fi and fantasy, but on occasion branches into other genres to keep things interesting. Alex is a genderqueer writer from the wilds of northern Canada who loves exploring other people and cultures. Alex is a recent graduate of UNBC with a BA in English, and as a result has an unhealthy obsession with Victorian Gothic literature. Alex has been writing from an early age, but is happy to keep learning to improve on their writing skills. And finally, I'm your moderator, Austin Chant. I also am a queer trans person, and I write stuff. I don't want to read my own bio. Who wants to do that? So we're going to jump right in, and I'm just going to have everybody first go down the line and start off talking about real quick, in a few words, how does being a trans creator influence your work? And I'm going to make Tobi go first.
Hey, so I think one of the key things for me is actually what I was talking about in my keynote a little bit. I think there's this strong pattern that there's a lot of cis people writing trans stories, and it's all about transition. It's all about, this person is transitioning, everything's changing, and that's kind of the fascination. But then when trans people write trans stories, you get psychic hackers fighting cops. You get all kinds of interesting, weird, wild things where there's, a trans person in the story, but we get to have just as many adventures as everybody else. And I think one of the key balances is trying to write a story that is not about necessarily transitioning, but is still about being trans, or that at least is still impacted by being trans. I see the other thing I see a lot of people ending up doing is writing a story where they're like, oh, I'll just make it so that being trans doesn't actually change anything in their life, and it actually does. And having the kind of like personal experience and knowledge and perspective and community to draw upon, to know all of the different ways that, like, you know, if you have your trans character going to jail, like maybe there are some trans specific things that you should include, and those are the kinds of things that are just second nature to me.
Building a little, I think, on that, I feel like a lot of what drives me to write at all is the fact that the stories I want to read don't already exist. And that's definitely impacted by, you know, the fact that I am, you know, writing from a gender minority position. And that, you know, I don't want to be reading the transition story. I don't want to be reading the coming out story. Those are stories that are valuable and that people need, but they're not the only stories to be told about us. And I feel like that's kind of always in the back of my mind when I'm, you know, when I'm trying to come up with something new. What is the story that I want to read about someone like me?
So I would definitely second everything that you two have already said. You know, obviously for me, being a trans creator, writing about trans people allows me to pull from my personal experience, you know, and also create those narratives that didn't exist, you know, when I was looking for books, and so on. But I think that as kind of a creative person, it also allows me to rethink some of the narratives and structure that have been really prevalent in our literary tradition, that were created, you know, and function specifically to tell cis stories. And in order for me to create these trans narratives and tell trans stories in ways that feel really authentic to me, I have to go outside of those structures and narratives often. And that, to me, is a great joy, not only because it allows me to create these trans narratives, but it also challenges me as a creative individual. So, yeah, that's really what I bring, being trans brings to my creative life, I guess.
Hi. I think as a trans person and as a genderqueer person in specifically, there's this thing that you can do where you can kind of transcend stereotypes, not only about people like yourself, but about people all across spectrums and you know, all different kinds of people. Because as a genderqueer person, you're kind of not actually, but automatically exempt from stereotypes that people might have about men and women. And because of that, you can kind of see that underneath that is a person, and that there's not really, the stereotypes don't really apply. And when you're looking at a character, if you're looking at them without all those stereotypes that you might automatically assume belong to them, then you can really get at the depth of the character. And yeah, I just think having a perspective as a person that exists between, you know, established stereotypes and can help you look at that kind of thing easier.
Wow, you guys took all the good answers. Anyways, yeah, just to continue on, as a genderqueer person, I like to explore all of the different types of genderqueer that are out there, like all the way from like agender to whatever other, I'm gender fluid, there's like third gender and bigender and all those other things. I want to explore everything that there is to explore and to have more than one character that fulfills that type of role, just because I want people out there, to continue on from my keynote, that can find themselves in that character and to know that they're not by themselves and that other people experience the same things that they do. I think that's it.
Great, thank you everyone. A really quick note, I do want to save some time for questions if anybody has questions, but we have like 9 million questions that we also want to talk about. So if you think of questions while the panel is going on, if you could jot those down on a piece of paper, there's lots of stuff in the swag bags to write on, and just pass those forward. I'll collect them at the end. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was, broadly speaking, what have your experiences of publishing trans romance been like? If you have any experiences that you can share, and we can popcorn around. Alex, you want to start since you got cheated last time?
Okay, awesome. Well, I've published 2 trans novels so far. One called Love Rampage, and the other one called Charmed by Chance. And so far, in my experiences publishing trans fiction, I haven't had many problems, mostly because my publisher is really looking for a diverse cast. So far I haven't had any problems, and I've avoided looking at reviews, so I don't know whether I've had any transphobic ones yet. I'm sure some brave person will tell me if I do, but so far I haven't had much trouble.
Yeah, my experience in as a trans person in queer publishing has been really positive. I think it was, the romance community, especially the queer romance community, was really the first place that I could really be myself and start to express myself. When I decided to change my pronouns to they, them pronouns, I emailed my publisher less than 3 and asked them if I could change my bio, and they were totally good about it. So it's great to be around other people. Like, it's great to just come here and be around other queer people and around people that, I can kind of assume will respect me and my pronouns and my identity in a way that I'm largely invisible in my day-to-day life. So it's a really awesome opportunity for me.
So I'm going to be like the naysayer and be like, my experience has been a really mixed bag. I think that, while I have worked with some great people in the industry, I've also had issues where publishers have given me, have hassled me about, my pronouns. I've had publishers that have used just really unfortunate transphobic language in their submission calls and their guidelines, and then, responded really negatively when I've emailed them being like, this language is not okay. I was, just talking about what I'm seeing more and more now in romance is publishers who will say something along the lines of, we support the full spectrum of LGBTQ literature, but we're really only interested in cisgender male-male. So only submit that to us. That's becoming really kind of common where publishers will kind of give lip service to, we're LGBTQ friendly, we're allies, but really only what they're looking for is that very kind of niche, cisgendered, most marketable romance. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I've definitely been supported. I've definitely been really, really grateful to interact with editors and authors and people in the industry who have been really supportive. But unfortunately, my experience has been, it's been a pretty rocky road. So, yeah.
Yeah, it does. There is definitely a spectrum among publishers of how well publishers are supporting trans content and trans creators. I think I've run into some of the same, while there are some publishers who have been really good about, yes, oh, absolutely, we can use neutral pronouns for you, then there are some who, who are still acting like they don't understand why you'd want such a thing. And so we do still have a ways to go.
I'd say that one of the biggest difficulties about publishing, no matter who you are, is just breaking into publishing. A lot of it is about who you know and what connections you have. For my latest book, I had the idea for it, and I remembered having gone to dinner with the publisher who published my ex's book, and I sent them an email and I said, hey, here's my book idea, and I just had 100 comments on Facebook within 6 hours for people who think this is a good idea. Do you want to publish this book? And they said, sure. And so that was great, but if you don't have dinner with your ex's publisher, then that might be a little more difficult. And I think that a lot of my experiences around publishing has been limited in different ways. One of the big ones is pitch. A lot of my work, I write stuff primarily for a trans audience. And of course, like, I want cis folks to read it too, but when I'm figuring out how I want to design it, I have trans audiences in mind first. And a lot of publishers will take a look at that and just say, the market isn't big enough. There's not enough trans people to buy enough books, so you have to write the book for cis people. And that just is really limiting. Also, I find that a lot of times I find myself getting work published in other people's books, submitting to anthologies that have an idea that is not necessarily my idea. And sometimes that can work out really well when I kind of like push them or stretch them. I remember I submitted a story to Best Lesbian Erotica 2010 that included 2 trans women. And I had this like in the back of my mind, are they actually seriously gonna do this? Like, or are they going to be like, well, maybe one trans woman, but if there's no cis women in the story, and they did, and they included it, and so like there's opportunities to push that way, but a lot of times I find that where I've actually been getting published lately have been with really small startup trans-focused publishing companies. Like one-person companies that are funded by Kickstarter, essentially, and that's how my children's book got published. A Kickstarter campaign that somebody else threw, and then one of their authors dropped out, and so he called me and said, "Hey, I need an author to write a children's book story," and I thought of you, and so like those kinds of things happen primarily through connections, but it's a world of a difference to be dealing with small publishers run by one person who have some one-time startup funds from Kickstarter, and that's it. And probably that's, you know, there's one book or one batch of books that they're doing, and that's it. And being limited in that way, it's really different having access to established publishing companies.
Well, there's something deeply ironic, I think, about really large publishers with incredible reach and a built-in audience saying, "Oh, we can't find an audience," whereas a really small, you know, Kickstarter-funded, you know, 2-person press will say, "Oh yeah, that's really important. We'll do that. We'll do it anyway." I would really like to see larger publishers taking risks like that, quote-unquote risks, because again, those are the people who have the least to lose and the greatest capacity to find an audience. Thank you for that. I am wondering, how does it feel for all of you to work on stories with trans characters, and how does it feel to work on stories without trans characters? I think we've all probably done one or the other or both.
Okay, I'll go.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have written a few stories that don't really have trans characters. When I very first started out, I was starting out with male, which is like, you know, the basis for a lot of LGBTQ publishers, is that male is like the main pairing for everybody. So I started out with that. But I felt that I really, really wanted to write stories with trans characters, and for me, it's much more fulfilling to be able to write trans characters and genderqueer characters specifically, because I never, before I started writing for Lesson 3, I never saw any genderqueer characters out there. I think I maybe read one book that had a genderqueer character. So for me, it was really important to be able to write my experiences and other people's experiences into characters.
For me, writing books with trans characters and genderqueer characters is really important, and it's something I'm really excited about and something I really enjoy doing. But it's also really tiring for me. It's exhausting because, you know, if you're someone who writes primarily for like escapism, then writing about dysphoria and a trans person dealing with transphobia every day is it can hit a little bit too close to home. So I need to like pace myself, and I'll write a story with cis characters where I can escape and just write about stuff that has nothing to do with me. And then I'll write a story with trans characters and focus on that. And yeah, the stories with trans characters, they tend to be more rewarding for me and close to the heart for me and important for me. But I do need to pace myself and make sure that I'm writing stories that aren't always like really difficult for me to write and really heart-wrenching for me to write.
So, you know, when I started out my career, I was writing exclusively stories about cisgendered people. And I came into the industry at a time when the attitude was really, you couldn't write trans romance. You couldn't sell it, you couldn't publish it, no one was gonna want it. You know, I had readers who, you know, would say, you know, if you want to write that, that's fine, but like I don't want to have anything to do with it. If you write it, you know, I'm never going to read you again. You know, like it was hardcore. And so I kind of internalized a lot of that, and I had a lot of fear around writing trans characters. And so I didn't, you know, for the first couple years of my career. And then when I did start, I would write a trans character with cisgendered love interest, because I always wanted to have that kind of quote unquote like safe space for, you know, I was still at that point presuming that my readership was predominantly cis, and I was like, well, there has to be a cis character there, you know, for them to empathize with, because they're not going to empathize with the trans character, you know, pulling from that kind of internalized, nobody wants these narratives. And then, you know, I was like, well, that's really coming from a lot of internalized transphobia and negativity that, you know, has to do with kind of the way the industry was and my experience with the industry, and that can't define who I am as an author. So I made like a promise with myself that I was going to write predominantly for a trans audience, and that I was going to write stories that really centered the trans character, that either had only trans characters or only trans main characters, or really, really centered the trans character and their narrative. And that was a big kind of turning point for me in my career. You know, I don't know if that's been at all like obvious from the outside, but like for me as an author and as a creative person, that was a big deal. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's answering the question at all, but that's kind of like been my experience coming from a position of writing only cisgendered characters to now having my focus be completely on writing trans characters and trans narratives.
I feel like my experience here echoes JK's a lot, that while it feels really important to me, you know, to try and include trans and genderqueer characters, to try and write those narratives, it's also emotionally much more high stakes for me to engage in doing it. It's, you know, trying to negotiate how to get characters to their happy ending in a love story when I'm confronting the dysphoria that is still kind of a major part of my life. It's an additional layer of complication that isn't there when I'm, when I'm writing characters for whom that's not an issue. And I don't feel especially good about having that problem, but there it is.
I mostly write trans characters, and in fact, I had to really think to try and come up with times that I wrote stories that didn't include trans characters. And I think for me, writing trans characters, it just feels normal. And one of the things I really like doing is being able to mine the depths of different kinds of trans experience, including several different trans characters who maybe have very different trans experiences, maybe even get into arguments about their different trans experiences, and those kinds of things. And when I think about times I write stories that don't include trans characters, I'm reminded of a thing that a friend of mine who I mentioned in my talk, Morgan M. Page, said one time when she was reading a book and was reviewing the book. And just as an aside on her social media, she wrote that she was reviewing the book and couldn't help but want to put in the little note, it's great, it's a great story. I think it would feel a little bit more realistic if there was a stressed out trans woman in it. And then she started thinking about other stories and was like, yeah, that story would be more realistic if there was a stressed out trans woman in it. Until finally she just kind of realized that her life has a lot of stressed out trans women. And it doesn't feel like real life if there isn't a stressed out trans woman. It's not true to life. And similarly, when I write stories that don't have trans people in them, it kind of feels subversive. It feels like I don't know, I'm getting away with something. And when the times that I write stories that don't have trans people, that aren't connected to my community and my experience, I like to go as far as possible away from my communities and my experience. And so I write about privileged cis white jerks who are raised in upper class, having a lot of money and not paying attention to other people's feelings, and so then I write in such a way that it is still a commentary around the different dynamics that I experience, although it's that commentary by looking at it from the other perspective.
This was one, I think, that came up on Twitter when I asked for questions. What do you wish non-trans authors knew about writing trans characters? Especially because conversations come up a lot in the industry about people writing outside their lane or outside their own personal experience. And I've definitely read, personally, a lot of really wonderful books by cisgender authors with trans characters, and I've read some not so wonderful books. Yeah, does anybody have thoughts on specifically what they wish people would think about or know?
So I wrote down a couple of things for this one, because in editing an anthology, I had to go through a lot of stories and narrow them down, and narrowing them down was difficult. But one thing that helped was having a couple of tests that would help me determine, is this telling the kind of trans story I want to be telling? And so, one of those tests is, if you rewrote the story so that all the trans characters were cis characters, would it take a significant amount of work and radically change the story? And if I could ask myself that question and say, no, it wouldn't be very hard. You just take out the part where they say I'm trans, and then it's a cis story. then it's not actually a trans story. And even like one story I remember reading at some point, I was kind of like, you know, you're using gender-neutral pronouns for this character. But if you weren't using gender-neutral pronouns for this character, there would be absolutely nothing in this story that would feel trans in any way. And so it's like that's helpful for thinking about what else needs to go into it. I would also say that make sure it's about a trans character and not a cis person discovering a trans person. Really try to write it from the trans person's perspective if you can. Like if you're worried or having any difficulty, that's a great way to sidestep. I've seen so many things where the actual story is like 50% transphobic monologue, inner monologue that the cis character is having when they meet the trans character. And you know, it can be fun to explore like magical or sci-fi gender experiences, but if you're doing that, make sure it's a trans person's magical gender experiences. A lot of people I've seen, I guess maybe less so now, but older writings, cis authors would be like, I'm writing a trans character. What's a trans character like? It's someone whose gender has changed. What would my experience be like if my gender changed? And they read a story about a cis person whose gender changed. And that's not a trans story. Or like, you know, you're write an erotica story about like cis people who swap genitals because they're cyborgs. And it's like, that's interesting, but it's still cis people swapping genitals. And they're reacting to the situation like cis people do. And so, like, actually, let's see what it would look like to have trans people swap genitals. And what is that difference, and can you write it? And then the one other thing that I would also say is make sure your trans characters have trans community, especially if it is set in the present, because it is just flat out, like there's a lot of isolation, and that's true, but it's kind of unrealistic at this point for a trans individual to not at the very least have trans friends through the internet. And if you're at the point where you know what being trans is, and you know that you need to transition and you've started transitioning, then you probably have met another trans person, and you're probably relying on someone for support. And so many stories written by cis people just focus on one single trans character who has no trans friends, who doesn't know any other trans people. When issues come up that they would normally go to their trans friends for help, they don't. And I think it's really disingenuous to do that, because one of the most important things about our experiences in our communities is the resilience that we have through our support networks. And if nothing else, that's important to model, but it's also just like an incredible part of what trans experiences are like when dealing with difficult situations.
Yeah, I wanted to interject real quick. One of the best pieces of like empathy building and writing advice I ever saw, and I wish I could remember who it was a Tumblr post, was like, a lot of times people think about the trans experience as if they, you know, changed one day, not as if they were their gender, but were mistaken for another gender, or had to go through life enacting a different gender, which is actually much more true to the experiences of myself, most trans people, all trans people. Anyway, carry on. One of you go.
I don't have all that much to add. You know, I would like, you know, cis authors to know that it's okay to write trans narratives that don't focus on transition, especially medical transition, that there are other parts of trans narratives and other stories that you can have trans characters where that's not the focus. And also, I see, you know, a lot of cis authors, in romance in particular, really want to write stories about trans people and narratives, trans narratives for young adults. And I think that that is amazing, and that's great. And trans youth are particularly in a bad position a lot of times and need that support. At the same time, A lot of people, a lot of trans people that I know, don't come out until they're older, and they're no longer in that young adult range, and they need that support too. You know, they do that figuring it out and being vulnerable and needing those books at an older age. So I wish that people who kind of have those good intentions of writing these great narratives that are going to help, trans readers through that feeling like, oh my God, I'm the only person in the world who has ever experienced this, would realize that older trans people need that as well as trans people in their teens or very early 20s. So, I guess that's like the only thing that I have to add.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about research. If you're going to write a story about a trans person and you're cis, you need to do your research. And that doesn't necessarily mean like getting a big book out of the library on like the history of trans people and what is gender dysphoria and all that. If you really want to know about trans people, my number one piece of advice is always to go to YouTube, because there are hours and hours and hundreds and thousands of hours of trans people blogging about their experience being trans, their experience transitioning medically, socially, and just things that happen in their life. And you can just sit there and watch these people that you can get to know talk about it. And it's great because you don't have to approach a trans person and be like, tell me about your transition. They're there telling you about it for free. And that's really an invaluable research source. And it's great for writing people of all different marginalized communities, because you can just go online and search for blogs, people talking about their experiences, and that's the best way to learn about people and their experiences, so that you can write a more true to life and accurate representation of trans people and marginalized people.
Okay, my advice is you can write more than one of us. You can put more than one trans person in the story. Let's avoid the tokenism where you only put one trans person in there for sort of diversity issues or whatever. You can put more than one of us in there, and you can make us different too. We don't have a universal sort of hive brain mind that we're all trans. Yeah.
Are you sure?
Okay. Yeah, that's my advice, is that like Tobi said, there's community too, where there's where people have a connection with other trans people and other queer people that can help each other out too. So yeah, that's it.
Cool. So I do want to, if folks have questions that they have scribbled down, feel free to pass those forward. Are there any? And raise your hand if you have a question that you want to have answered up here. Because if there aren't, I've certainly got more. All right. All right, we're going to keep going then. Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And I think it also hurts more when it comes from within the LGBTQ community to see a resistance to trans narratives there as well. I went to Powell's in Oregon the other day, and they have a gay and lesbian section, a tiny little, section that's B, and then, trans stuff is often gender studies. It's like you go through like feminist studies and then trans stuff is all the way out there. And it's a really weird divide, and I definitely would really like to see more of that cohesion and more embracing of queer trans narratives, ace trans narratives. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has feelings on that, but.
I would just say, I think that's definitely a very real dynamic that we deal with, and also not to throw out the straight community. I think a lot of times there's this idea that automatically the gay, lesbian, bi community is going to be less transphobic, and it's just not always true. When I was transitioning, the gay bar was the most transphobic bar. They will like grab your ID, look at your gender marker, announce it to the entire bar, and then like not allow you to use the bathroom. But like going to the straight bar, like you could even talk about being trans and no one would really bat an eye. And I think in a similar kind of way, like we do need to be working on how we affect the queer community and the queer infrastructure. But we don't necessarily have to, give up on straight community until we have queer community set up first. That there's been some really good works out there that have relied on straight community that have been, a pretty surprisingly positive outcome. And then also, when you say about like including a trans character and people get legit upset, I see that happening, and when that happens, it kind of makes me want to like jump in and try to control their environment so that they can't get any stories that don't have trans people. Like if it's like this anthology, or like especially if it's something I control, right? If it's like there's this anthology or something happening and they're really upset that there's a trans character in it, it's like fine, next year they're all gonna have trans characters in them.
I think I said something on Twitter about that the other day about surprise vaginas, about people who want their gay or man-on-man action and then they realize that their lovely romance has a trans man in it and they're so upset. And they like, I didn't want there to be a vagina in this, and that's like, it's incredibly transphobic because you're reducing the character down to their genitals, and it's just something that I think a lot of us as people who have written gay romance or lesbian romance with trans characters have experienced. So there's a long way to go in that way too.
Yeah, as somebody who writes, at this point, a lot of MM and FF, I really want to feel comfortable writing trans characters in that and not feel like I have to. I mean, I want to flag it in the sense that I want trans readers to be able to find that work, but I don't want it to be like, okay, and everybody who wants like cis MM go somewhere else. It's hard to feel like it's gonna be like MM but with a star or something like that. Not to shame the asterisk. Do you have any other questions or sweet comments from folks in the audience? Or I have like a lightning round question that I could ask. Lightning round? Okay. So I just wanted to go real quick. What is your favorite trope to see in trans romance, and is it different from your favorite romance trope in general?
This is one of those questions that I actually wrote down an answer to, so I was like, yes. So actually, a lot of the tropes that I love in romance, I love whether or not they have cis characters, whether or not they have trans characters. And for me, seeing a story that like has like geeks in love, but now they're trans is just like extra cool. The one that I'm like always talking about on Twitter, so some of you may know this already about me, is that there's a trope in historical romance where usually one of the characters, the main characters, usually the female character like cross-dresses and pretends to like be a man or whatever for a good portion of the book, and then goes back to being cis because they were cis all along. And I am like I've written at least one book where they turn out to be a trans character and we're a trans character all along. And like, I'm in dire need of that. I'm always, to like all my writing friends, I'm like, do that. Especially if they write historical romance. Write that trope for me.
I desperately want more like really intense enemies to lovers kind of stuff with trans characters. Like, give us intense situations, not just like cute stuff.
One of the things I think of is the trope around scarcity. And I've heard this from so many trans people in real life, the kind of like, nobody will ever date me because lesbians want this, straight men want this, and they do this whole equation, assuming that all attractions require both gender and genitalia of a specific format, right? And so they kind of come down to be like, and nobody will ever date me. And that's really horrifying to me to see that coming from so many people. And I see that actually being reinforced in a negative way in a lot of stories where it's trying to be like, it's the fantasy of like, oh, and they love me even though I'm trans. And like I see that even coming from trans authors who are like desperately needing and wanting that, but it also reinforces this kind of message of like, oh, of course they wouldn't. But then when they do, that's the fantasy, that's the escapism. And I really like to see stories where the trope is challenging scarcity, like where the love interest starts like being a little mean and is like, hey, you should do X, Y, or Z because like you're not going to get any better. Because you're trans and you should, so like I'm doing you a favor, and so then have the protagonist then shut them down and be like, no fucking way, and get out of here, and I'm going to this sex party where everyone's gonna fuck me.
Alex, did you have one down there?
I don't have any really favorite tropes except enemies to lovers, which is my favorite one ever.
Yes.
But one of the ones that really bothers me is gay for you, or which is like also it can sort of apply to trans people where it's sort of like I'm attracted to you even though you're trans, and that really bothers me just because it's a bit transphobic in that the person isn't normally attracted to trans people, but they find themselves magically attracted to somebody who's trans, and it just bothers me. Yeah, so that's my spiel.
Laylah, did you have any favorite or least favorite tropes?
I'm honestly so bad at picking out favorite tropes, but I think probably, I do have like a terrible, terrible weakness for, the badass femme, and really I think she's only better as a trans woman.
Awesome. Well, so we actually just ran out of time. However, if you have any more questions or comments, or you'd just like to chat with us, we'll be around today. Most of us, I think, at the book fair. We'll be at the after party, so please feel free to come talk. And also, we have a treat for you. Up at the front of the room, there's a pink Post-it note and some stacks of paper. Those are our reading recommendations to you. They're all trans romance, or they're not all genre romance. They are all romantic. There's some YA, general fiction, erotica. It's mostly romance. And feel free to take one for your friends. I think we have a bunch of copies. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much.